Imagine you're a samurai in Japan in 1850, a member of the warrior elite, part of a class that has ruled this country for 7 centuries. Your ancestors fought in legendary battles, served great lords, and upheld the code of Bushido. But here's your reality. You're essentially broke. You haven't drawn your sword in combat in over 200 years because Japan has been at peace since the Tokugawa shogunate unified the country in 1603. Your stipend is paid in rice, which made sense when rice was the foundation of the economy. But now there's this thing called money that merchants use, and somehow these merchants, who are supposed to be the lowest social class below you, are living in luxury while you're struggling to maintain the appearance of status on an income that hasn't increased in generations. And something even stranger is happening. The entire system that elevated warriors above all others, that organized society around military service and rice production, is collapsing. Not because of war or foreign invasion, but because the economy has fundamentally changed in ways that make the whole feudal structure obsolete. And within 20 years, your class will be abolished, the shogunate will fall, and Japan will transform from a feudal society into a modern industrializing nation faster than any country in history. And at the heart of this transformation is something that seems mundane, but is actually revolutionary. The mismatch between an economy based on rice and a society that increasingly runs on money. And understanding how this happened, how Japan's rice-based feudal economy created the conditions for its own destruction, and why the samurai class that ruled for centuries became economically obsolete, teaches us profound lessons about how economic systems shape social structures, how technological and commercial change can undermine political systems, and how sometimes the most stable-seeming orders are actually brittle, held together by economic arrangements that can shift beneath them. Let's start with understanding how feudal Japan's economy actually worked, because it was fundamentally different from European feudalism in crucial ways. The entire system was based on rice, which wasn't just a crop, it was literally the measure of wealth and power. Land was measured not in acres, but in koku, a unit representing the amount of rice needed to feed one person for 1 year, roughly 150 kilograms. And a lord's power was measured by how many koku his domain produced. A daimyo, a feudal lord, might control a domain producing 100,000 koku, which meant theoretically he could support 100,000 people, though in practice much of that rice went to the samurai who served him and to the shogun as tribute. And samurai were paid not in money but in rice stipends. A low-ranking samurai might receive 50 koku per year, a high-ranking one might receive several thousand. And this rice could be consumed directly or sold for money to buy other goods. So rice was simultaneously food, currency, measure of wealth, and the basis of political power. And this system worked perfectly well as long as the economy remained primarily agricultural and as long as rice remained the dominant store of value and medium of exchange. The Tokugawa shogunate, established in 1603 after Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan, created a political system designed to maintain stability and prevent the kind of civil wars that had plagued Japan for over a century. And the economic policy that supported this system was called the Senkinkotai, or alternate attendance system, which required all daimyo to spend alternate years in Edo, the shogun's capital in modern-day Tokyo. And when they were in their own domains, they had to leave their wives and heirs in Edo as essentially hostages. And this system was brilliant for maintaining control, because daimyo had to maintain 2 residences, one in Edo and one in their domain. They had to travel back and forth with large retinues to display their status, and all of this was extremely expensive, which prevented them from accumulating the resources to rebel. But here's the unintended consequence. This system required enormous movement of people and goods. It created a massive service economy along the roads between domains and Edo. It stimulated urban growth, particularly in Edo, which became one of the largest cities in the world, and it gradually monetized the economy, because you can't pay for inns, food, entertainment, and services along the road with rice. You need money. So the very system designed to maintain feudal control was inadvertently creating a commercial economy that would undermine feudal structures. As the Tokugawa period progressed, particularly from the late 1600s through the 1800s, Japan experienced remarkable economic development despite, or perhaps because of the country's isolation from most foreign trade. Agriculture became more productive through better techniques and infrastructure. Urban areas grew dramatically. Manufacturing developed, particularly textiles, ceramics, and craft goods, and a sophisticated merchant class emerged that facilitated trade, provided credit, and accumulated substantial wealth. And all of this economic activity increasingly operated using money rather than rice. Merchants traded in currency, craftsmen were paid in currency, urban workers received wages in currency, and even in rural areas, peasants were increasingly selling their rice for money rather than consuming it all directly. So you had this growing commercial money economy developing alongside and eventually overshadowing the official rice-based feudal economy. And this created all sorts of problems for the samurai class who were still being paid in rice stipends that were fixed by tradition and political arrangements. Here's where the economic crisis for samurai becomes acute, because while samurai stipends were fixed in terms of rice, the actual value of rice relative to other goods and services was changing and generally declining. As agricultural productivity improved and population growth slowed, rice became relatively less scarce, and as commercial goods became more available and desirable, their prices relative to rice increased. So a samurai receiving 100 koku per year might find that this bought less and less in terms of the goods and services they actually wanted to consume, particularly in cities where commercial economy dominated, and samurai couldn't just switch careers or start businesses because that would violate their status. They were warriors. Engaging in commerce was beneath them, and the rigid social hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan made it very difficult to change status. So samurai were trapped, locked into a fixed income and a currency that was depreciating relative to the rest of the economy, while watching merchants, who were theoretically the lowest social class, accumulate wealth and live in obvious luxury. The debt crisis that engulfed samurai is particularly revealing, because as their real incomes declined, many samurai borrowed money from merchants, using their future rice stipends as collateral, and these debts compounded over time, with interest rates that could be substantial, and eventually many samurai owed so much to merchant creditors that they were essentially selling their entire stipends just to service debt. And this created a bizarre inversion of the social hierarchy. You had high status samurai who were legally superior to merchants, who could theoretically execute commoners for disrespect, but who were economically dependent on and indebted to those same merchants. And this contradiction between the legal and social superiority of samurai and their economic inferiority and dependence created deep tensions and resentments that would eventually contribute to the overthrow of the entire system. The shogunate's attempts to address these problems often made them worse, because the shogun and daimyo understood that samurai poverty was a problem. It undermined military readiness, it created political instability, and it made the entire system look ridiculous when the warrior elite was visibly impoverished. So they tried various reforms. Sometimes they would decree debt forgiveness, simply canceling samurai debts to merchants, which provided temporary relief to samurai but destroyed trust in credit markets and made merchants reluctant to lend in the future. Sometimes they would try to restrict merchant activities or luxury consumption, sumptuary laws that prohibited merchants from displaying wealth. But these were largely ineffective because you can't legislate away economic reality. Sometimes they would try to encourage samurai to become more productive, to engage in side businesses, or even agriculture. But this contradicted the entire ideology of the samurai class as warriors above economic activity. So none of these reforms addressed the fundamental problem, which was that the economic basis of samurai status, the rice stipend system, was becoming obsolete in an increasingly commercial economy. The peasant situation adds another dimension to this crisis, because peasants, who produced the rice that paid samurai stipends, were also under pressure. They faced heavy taxation, typically paying 40 to 50% of their crop as tax, and they were legally bound to the land, unable to move or change occupation. But as commercial opportunities developed, peasants increasingly found ways to evade these restrictions. Some moved to cities illegally, some shifted from rice production to more profitable commercial crops, some became involved in rural manufacturing or trade, and this created labor shortages in some areas, reduced rice production, and decreased the tax base that supported the entire feudal structure. So you had simultaneous crises. Samurai were impoverished by fixed rice stipends in a monetizing economy. Peasants were evading feudal obligations to pursue commercial opportunities, and merchants were accumulating wealth and economic power while remaining socially subordinate. And all of these tensions were consequences of the fundamental mismatch between the feudal rice-based economic structure and the emerging commercial money-based economy. The arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853, demanding that Japan open to foreign trade, crystallized all these existing tensions and contradictions, because Perry's arrival made clear that Japan was militarily weak compared to Western powers. And this was humiliating, particularly for the samurai class, whose entire justification was military prowess. And it became obvious that defending Japan would require modernization, would require Western military technology, industrial production, and institutional reforms. But these things required money, required investment, required economic mobilization that the rice-based feudal system couldn't provide. And this created a crisis of legitimacy for the Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled for 250 years but now appeared incapable of defending the country in various domains. Particularly Satsuma and Choshu in Western Japan began modernizing independently, borrowing money, buying Western weapons, training modern military forces, and essentially creating the institutional and economic basis for overthrowing the shogunate. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, where the emperor was restored to formal power and the shogunate abolished, is often presented as a political revolution, but it was fundamentally an economic transformation. The new Meiji government immediately set about dismantling the feudal economic system, and the changes were radical and swift. First, they abolished the Han system where daimyo controlled domains, replacing it with a centralized prefectural system where governors were appointed by the central government. Second, they abolished the system of rice stipends and replaced them with bonds, essentially buying out the samurai class. Samurai would receive government bonds that paid interest for a period of years, but after that, nothing. So at a stroke, the economic basis of samurai status was eliminated. Third, they abolished the legal distinctions between social classes. Samurai, peasants, merchants, all became citizens with equal legal status, at least in theory. Fourth, they introduced land reform where peasants could own land and pay taxes in money rather than rice. And fifth, they introduced conscription, creating a modern military based on universal male service rather than a hereditary warrior class. So within a few years of the Meiji Restoration, the entire feudal structure that had existed for 7 centuries was dismantled and replaced with modern economic and social institutions. The transition was traumatic for samurai, because they went from being the ruling class to being unemployed warriors in a country that no longer needed warriors, and many samurai resisted. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 was the last major samurai revolt, where traditionalist samurai led by Seigo Takamori fought against the new conscript army, and the samurai lost, defeated by peasant soldiers with modern weapons, symbolizing the complete military obsolescence of the warrior class. But beyond military defeat, samurai faced economic challenges. The bonds they received in exchange for their stipends provided some income for a while, but many samurai sold these bonds at discount to raise immediate cash. And once the bonds expired, they had no income and no obvious skills for the new economy. Some samurai successfully transitioned to business, government service, or other occupations. Many of the early Meiji government officials, military officers, and business leaders were former samurai who adapted their skills to new contexts, but many others struggled, fell into poverty, and became nostalgic for a past that seemed more honorable than the money-grubbing modern world. And this nostalgia for samurai values would persist in Japanese culture even as the actual samurai class disappeared. The economic logic that drove this transformation is worth examining carefully, because it shows how economic structures determine what political and social systems are sustainable. The feudal rice-based system worked when Japan was primarily agricultural, when warfare was frequent and required a professional warrior class, and when long-distance trade was limited, so local rice production determined wealth. But as Japan developed a commercial economy, as cities grew, as manufacturing expanded, and as peace made professional warriors largely ornamental, the rice-based system became economically irrational. It allocated resources to an unproductive warrior class. It prevented capital accumulation by fixing incomes and depreciating rice stipends. It restricted economic activity through rigid social hierarchies. and it prevented the flexibility and dynamism that modern economic development requires. So the Meiji transformation wasn't just about responding to Western pressure, though that was the immediate trigger. It was about aligning political and social institutions with economic realities, and once that alignment happened, Japan's economic development accelerated dramatically. Within 50 years, Japan went from feudal economy to industrial power capable of defeating Russia in war. The comparison to other feudal systems is instructive because Europe went through a similar transition from feudalism to capitalism, but it took centuries and involved numerous wars, revolutions, and social upheavals. Japan made the transition in decades, and while it wasn't peaceful, the violence was relatively contained compared to European experiences. And this speed was possible partly because the contradictions of the feudal system had become so obvious by the mid-19th century. Everyone could see that rice stipends and rigid social hierarchies were economically dysfunctional. Everyone could see that merchant wealth and commercial activity were the actual drivers of prosperity, and everyone could see that Western nations with more flexible economic systems were more powerful. So there was a readiness for change even among many samurai who understood that preserving samurai privilege was less important than preserving Japan's independence and power. And this pragmatism, this willingness to abandon cherished institutions and identities when they became dysfunctional, is remarkable and helps explain Japan's successful modernization. The role of rice as both crop and currency is central to understanding this whole story, because rice's dual function created specific rigidities. In a purely monetary economy, authorities can adjust money supply, can inflate or deflate to manage economic conditions. But rice production is determined by agriculture, by weather, by technology, by the land. And you can't just increase or decrease the rice money supply at will. So when the economy needed more liquidity to support growing commercial activity, the rice-based system couldn't provide it, and money had to supplement and eventually replace rice. And once money became the primary medium of exchange and store of value, the rice stipend system became an anachronism. Samurai receiving payment in rice that they immediately had to sell for money were essentially receiving their stipends in a depreciated currency. And this made their economic obsolescence obvious to everyone, including themselves. There's also something profound about how economic change precedes and determines political change. The Tokugawa shogunate didn't fall because of military defeat. It fell because the economic system it was built on had become obsolete. Merchants had accumulated economic power that contradicted their low social status. Samurai had lost economic power while retaining high status. And this mismatch created instability that eventually exploded in political revolution. And this pattern where economic transformation drives political change is common throughout history. But the Japanese case is particularly clear because the changes happened so rapidly and completely. You can see the direct causal chain from rice economy to money economy, from fixed stipends to samurai poverty, from economic contradictions to political crisis, and from political crisis to revolutionary transformation. The legacy of this transformation shaped modern Japan in profound ways. The emphasis on education and merit that helped former samurai transition to new roles became central to Japanese culture. The state-led modernization, where government actively promoted economic development, became the Japanese model that influenced other Asian countries. The tension between traditional values and modern economics created a distinctive Japanese modernity that tried to preserve cultural identity while embracing economic and technological change. And the trauma of rapid change created nostalgia for the samurai era that influences Japanese popular culture to this day. So the economic fall of feudal Japan wasn't just about ending an old system. It was about creating a new one. And that new system, for better and worse, shaped Japan's trajectory into the 20th century and beyond. Looking at the feudal Japanese experience from a modern perspective, we can draw several lessons. First, fixed incomes in a changing economy are disastrous. Samurai with rice stipends couldn't adapt to commercial economy, just as modern workers with wages that don't keep pace with inflation or economic change face declining living standards. Second, when economic reality conflicts with social ideology, economics eventually wins. You can maintain for a while that merchants are low status while they accumulate wealth, but eventually the contradiction becomes unsustainable. Third, Systems that seem stable can collapse rapidly when underlying economic foundations shift. Tokugawa Japan seemed eternally stable, but when economic contradictions became acute, it fell apart in a few years. Fourth, sometimes reform requires complete transformation rather than incremental change. The Tokugawa shogunate tried various reforms to address samurai poverty, but nothing worked because the fundamental system was obsolete. Only complete transformation in the Meiji period actually solved the problem. And fifth, the transition from one economic system to another is always traumatic for people whose identities and livelihoods are tied to the old system. Samurai weren't just losing income. They were losing their entire identity, purpose, and social status. And that made the transition painful even when it was necessary and ultimately beneficial for society as a whole. The story of samurai, rice taxes, and the economic fall of feudal Japan also reminds us that economic systems are never just about economics. They're about identity, meaning, social organization, and culture. Samurai weren't just government employees receiving payment. They were members of a warrior class with a sophisticated ideology of honor, loyalty, and martial virtue. And when the economic basis of that class disappeared, the entire ideology and identity came into question, and this created psychological and cultural crises that were as significant as the economic and political ones. And Japan is still in some ways working through these issues, still negotiating between traditional values and modern realities, still trying to preserve cultural identity while participating in global capitalism. And the roots of these tensions go back to the rapid transformation that destroyed feudal Japan and created modern Japan in the late 19th century. In the end, the economic fall of feudal Japan was caused by a simple but profound problem. An economy based on rice could not support a society that increasingly ran on money, and a social system that elevated warriors above all others could not survive in a peaceful country where commercial activity created more value than military prowess. And when these contradictions became acute, when American ships arrived and made clear that modernization was necessary for survival, the entire system collapsed and was replaced within a generation. And this transformation, driven by economic necessity but shaped by political choices and cultural values, created modern Japan. And the fact that this transformation was possible, that Japan could go from rice tax feudalism to industrial modernity so rapidly and relatively successfully, is testament to human adaptability and also to the power of economic forces that eventually overwhelm even the most entrenched political and social structures. Because in the long run, societies must organize themselves in ways that make economic sense, and when they don't, when social and political structures conflict with economic realities, something has to give, and usually it's the political and social structures that collapse, not the economic forces. And that's the ultimate lesson of samurai, rice taxes, and the economic fall of feudal Japan. That economic transformation is more fundamental than political ideology or social tradition, and that systems which fail to adapt to economic change, no matter how stable they appear or how revered their traditions, are ultimately doomed to collapse and be replaced by systems better suited to new economic realities.